Gunshots echoed in the distance as Grace Matthews stood motionless at her mother's bedside, the life having slipped away just moments before, leaving nothing but an empty shell and memories that stung like the desert sun. The small, weathered cabin that had been home for the past 3 years felt suddenly cavernous, the silence deafening as reality settled over her like the dust that perpetually coated everything in Cottonwood Springs, Arizona Territory, 1878. "Mama," Grace whispered, her voice cracking as she reached out to touch her mother's still warm hand. "I told you to wait for me." Sarah Matthews had been fighting consumption for months, gradually withering away despite Grace's desperate attempts to save her. They'd come west 3 years ago on the promise of dry air to heal Sarah's lungs, using the last of their savings from selling their small Pennsylvania farm after Grace's father died in a mining accident. But the West had offered no miracles, only hardship and now, finality. Grace sank to her knees beside the bed, her chestnut hair falling forward as she pressed her forehead against the rough woolen blanket. At 22, she was now truly alone in a world that had shown little kindness to women without protection. The meager coins in the jar on the shelf wouldn't cover a proper burial, let alone a coffin or a marker. The thought of her mother being dumped in a pauper's grave twisted Grace's insides with a pain sharper than hunger. A knock at the door startled her from her grief. Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smoothed her simple cotton dress, and moved reluctantly toward the door. Standing on the other side was Randall Cooper, the cowboy who'd been bringing them milk and eggs from his small ranch outside of town for the past year. "Miss Matthews," he said, removing his worn Stetson to reveal sun-bleached brown hair. His eyes, the color of the sky just before dusk, immediately registered the truth. "Your mother," Grace could only nod, tears threatening again as she stepped back, allowing him entry into the small cabin. Randall stepped inside, placing his hat on the table with gentle reverence. At 31, he'd seen his share of death on the frontier, but the sight of Grace's raw grief stirred something deep within him. He'd lost his own mother young, knew the hollow feeling that came with it. "I brought some fresh eggs and milk," he said softly, setting down a small basket. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner." "She went peaceful," Grace managed, her voice barely audible. "Just slipped away while I was heating water for tea," Randall nodded, his eyes moving to the still form on the bed. Sarah Matthews had been a kind woman, always offering him coffee despite having little to spare. He'd admired her grit, the way she'd faced her illness without complaint. And he'd admired Grace even more, watching her work herself to the bone, taking in laundry and mending to care for her mother. "Miss Matthews, Grace," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "What can I do to help?" The simple question broke something in Grace. She'd been holding herself together by sheer will, knowing that showing weakness in a town like Cottonwood Springs was dangerous for a woman alone. But Randall Cooper had always been different from the other men who drifted through, respectful, kind, without expectation. "I can't afford to bury her proper," she admitted, the words burning her throat with shame. "The undertaker wants $20 for a simple pine box. I have maybe 7 saved." Her hands twisted in her apron. "I can't bear the thought of her in the potter's field, Mr. Cooper. She deserves better than that." Randall's jaw tightened. He knew the undertaker, Silas Merrick, to be a greedy man who preyed on grief. $20 was robbery for a simple coffin. "Do you have a spot picked out? Somewhere your mother would have liked to rest?" he asked, already formulating a plan. Grace looked up at him, hope flickering briefly across her tear-stained face. "There's a place on the ridge east of town. We'd walk there sometimes when she was feeling stronger. You can see the whole valley and the mountains beyond. She always said it reminded her of heaven's view." Randall nodded, decision made. "I can build a coffin, got plenty of good pine at my place, and I'll dig the grave myself." "Mr. Cooper, I couldn't possibly." "Randall," he corrected gently. "And yes, you can. Your mother was a fine woman who never had an unkind word for anyone. It's the Christian thing to do." Grace stared at him, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. In 3 years, Cottonwood Springs had shown her little but indifference and occasional cruelty. Women alone were viewed with suspicion or as easy targets. She'd learned to keep to herself, to trust no one but her mother. Thank you, she whispered, the words inadequate for the relief flooding through her. I'll need to take measurements, he said, practical now. And we should lay her out proper. Do you have a dress she'd want to be buried in? Grace nodded. Her Sunday best, it's in the trunk. She moved to the battered wooden chest at the foot of the bed, lifting the lid to reveal a neatly folded blue dress, faded but clean, with tiny embroidered flowers around the collar that Sarah had stitched herself during better days. Together, they prepared Sarah's body with the quiet dignity of those accustomed to death's presence. Randall helped Grace wash her mother's face and hands, then respectfully stepped outside while Grace changed her into the blue dress. When he returned, they combed Sarah's silver-streaked hair and arranged her hands peacefully across her chest. She looks at peace, Randall said softly, standing beside Grace as they regarded the woman who'd fought so hard to stay alive for her daughter's sake. She was in so much pain at the end, Grace admitted, her voice breaking. I prayed for God to take her, then hated myself for it. That's not a sin, Grace, Randall said. That's love. The simple truth of his words loosened something in Grace's chest. She'd been carrying guilt along with her grief, and his understanding was like a balm. I'll go get my wagon and bring it around back, Randall said. We can lay her on the bed for now. I'll work through the night on the coffin and be back by dawn. Is that all right? Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. True to his word, Randall returned just as the first pink streaks of dawn were lighting the eastern sky. His wagon contained a simple but beautifully crafted pine coffin, the wood sanded smooth and lined with a clean white sheet. His clothes were sawdust-covered, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but his movements were sure as he helped Grace place her mother's body in the coffin. It's beautiful, Grace whispered, running her fingers along the smooth edge. How can I ever repay you? You don't, Randall said simply. Some things aren't about debts. They loaded the coffin carefully onto the wagon, covering it with a clean blanket. Randall had brought along his shovels and tools for digging the grave. As they set out toward the ridge, the town was just beginning to stir, a few curious eyes watching the wagon pass. Grace sat straight-backed beside Randall, dignity in every line of her body despite her threadbare dress and the pain etched on her face. The spot on the ridge was exactly as Grace had described, a gentle slope overlooking the entire valley, with the distant mountains purple against the horizon. Wildflowers dotted the ground, and a lone juniper tree provided dappled shade. It was peaceful, beautiful in the austere way of the Arizona Territory. Here, Grace said, stopping beneath the juniper. She would have liked this view. Randall nodded and began to work, removing his coat and rolling up his sleeves. The ground was hard, baked by the relentless sun, but he attacked it methodically, muscles straining as he broke through the surface layers. Grace tried to help, but he gently refused. This is my gift to you and your mother, he insisted. Please just sit in the shade. For hours, Randall dug, sweat soaking his shirt as the sun climbed higher. Grace sat nearby, occasionally reading passages from her mother's worn Bible. By midday, the grave was ready 6 feet deep and long enough to accommodate the coffin. They lowered Sarah's coffin together using ropes Randall had brought, the task requiring both their strengths. Once it rested at the bottom, Grace threw in a handful of wildflowers she'd gathered that morning. Randall stood with his hat in his hands as Grace read the 23rd Psalm, her voice clear and strong despite her grief. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. When she finished, Randall surprised her by singing Amazing Grace in a deep, rich baritone that carried across the ridge. His voice cracked on the final verse, and Grace realized he was crying too, not just for her mother, but perhaps for losses of his own. Together they filled in the grave, the physical labor somehow easing the sharpest edges of Grace's pain. When they finished, Randall produced a wooden cross he'd made alongside the coffin, Sarah Matthews' name and dates carefully carved into its surface. They placed it at the head of the grave, securing it firmly in the ground. Exhausted and grimy, they stood side by side looking at the fresh mound of earth. Thank you, Grace whispered. I don't know what I would have done without your help. You'd have found a way, Randall said. You're stronger than you know, Grace Matthews. As they turned to leave, Grace's composure finally broke. The reality of her mother's death, of her complete aloneness in the world, crashed over her like a wave. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Randall hadn't caught her, strong arms encircling her trembling form. Without hesitation, he held her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head as she sobbed into his shirt. He made no attempt to quiet her, just provided the strength she needed to fall apart. "Let it out," he murmured against her hair. "Just let it all out." And she did, crying until her throat was raw and her eyes burned. All the while, Randall held her, solid as the mountains on the horizon, until her tears gradually subsided into hiccuping breaths. "I'm sorry," she managed, embarrassed by her breakdown. "I've ruined your shirt." "It's seen worse," he said with gentle humor. "Besides, tears wash clean." As they stood there, the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, something shifted between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Both knew loss, both understood loneliness. And in that moment, an unspoken connection formed that would change both their lives forever. "Come on," Randall said gently. "Let's get you home before dark." But as they walked back to the wagon, both knew that home had taken on a new and uncertain meaning for Grace Matthews, one they would soon have to address. The ride back to town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Grace's cabin, Randall cleared his throat. "What will you do now?" he asked, the question hanging heavy in the air between them. Grace stared at her hands, folded in her lap. "I don't know," she admitted. "The cabin's paid until the end of the month after that." She shrugged, the gesture conveying the precariousness of her situation more eloquently than words. Randall guided the horses to a stop in front of the cabin. "You have skills," he said. "Your mending and laundry work is known to be the finest in town." "It barely kept us fed when there were two mouths," Grace said, "and without Mama." She couldn't finish the thought. Without her mother to care for, her purpose felt hollowed out. Randall helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the fading light, neither quite ready to part ways after the intensity of the day they'd shared. "Would you like me to come in?" Randall asked. "I could build a fire, make some coffee." The offer was innocent, practical, but Grace hesitated. A man in her home, even one as honorable as Randall Cooper had proven himself to be, would set tongues wagging in Cottonwood Springs. But the thought of entering the empty cabin alone, of facing the void her mother's absence had created, was suddenly unbearable. "Yes," she said simply. "I would appreciate that." Inside, the cabin felt different, colder, emptier. The impression of Sarah's body remained on the bed, and Grace found herself unable to look at it. Randall seemed to understand, busying himself with building a fire in the small stove while Grace moved around the room, lighting lamps against the gathering darkness. "When was the last time you ate?" Randall asked, noting her pallor and the way her dress hung on her frame. Grace tried to remember. "Yesterday morning, I think. I haven't been hungry." Randall nodded and, without asking permission, began rummaging through her meager supplies. He found some beans, a small piece of salt pork, and half an onion. Within minutes, he had a simple meal cooking on the stove, the homey smell filling the cabin. "You don't have to feed me," Grace protested weakly. "I know," Randall said, stirring the pot, "but my mama taught me never to let anyone go hungry if I could help it." They ate at the small table, the food simple but satisfying. Grace found her appetite returning despite herself, and Randall's quiet presence across from her was comforting in a way she hadn't expected. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, seeking distraction from her grief. Randall's face softened. "It's not much to look at yet," he admitted. 60 acres, a small cabin, a barn that leans a bit to the left, got a dozen head of cattle, some chickens, 2 milk cows, and Old Blue, my horse." "Sounds like heaven," Grace said wistfully. "It's peaceful," Randall agreed. "Been working it for 5 years now. Came west after the war with nothing but the clothes on my back and nightmares that wouldn't quit." Grace looked up, surprised by his candor. "You fought in the war," Randall nodded, shadows crossing his face. "Union cavalry, saw things no man should see. After it ended, couldn't stomach going back to Pennsylvania. Too many ghosts." He paused, studying her face. "Where in Pennsylvania were you from?" "A little town called Millbrook near Pittsburgh," Grace said. We had a small farm there until Papa died. I know Millbrook, Randall said, surprise in his voice. Passed through it during the war, pretty place with that stream running through the center of town. The coincidence made Grace smile for the first time that day. It was beautiful. Sometimes I miss the green of it, especially in summer when everything here is brown and parched. The desert has its own kind of beauty, Randall said. Takes time to see it, though. They talked until the fire burned low, discovering shared memories of Pennsylvania and similar reasons for coming west. Randall had lost his entire family parents to illness, 2 brothers to the war, and understood the gnawing emptiness of being truly alone. As the night deepened, Grace found herself reluctant for him to leave, yet aware of propriety. I should go, Randall said finally, reading her conflict. You need rest, Grace nodded, walking him to the door. I don't know how to thank you for today, she said, for everything. Randall placed his hat on his head, regarding her with those sky-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. No thanks needed, but I'd like to check on you tomorrow if that's all right. I'd like that, Grace admitted. After he left, Grace faced the empty cabin, forcing herself to strip the bed of its linens, unable to sleep where her mother had died. She made a pallet on the floor and lay awake for hours, replaying the day and wondering what the future held for a woman alone in a town that had little use for her kind, except in ways she wouldn't consider. True to his word, Randall returned the next day with more food and, to Grace's surprise, a job offer. My place needs a woman's touch, he said, sitting at her table. The cabin's a mess, my shirts are more patched than original cloth, and I can't cook worth a damn. I'm offering fair wages for you to come out a few days a week to set things right. Grace studied his face, looking for hidden meaning or impropriety, but found only honest need. People will talk, she said cautiously. Randall shrugged. People always talk. Question is, do you need the work? She did, desperately. The $7 she had saved wouldn't last the month, and the thought of becoming one of the sporting women who worked at the Silver Nugget Saloon made her stomach turn. Yes, she said. I need the work. Good, Randall said, looking relieved. I'll bring the wagon tomorrow morning. It's about an hour's ride. Over the next few weeks, a routine developed. 3 days a week, Randall would collect Grace in his wagon and take her to his small ranch. She would spend the day cleaning, mending, cooking meals that he could reheat, and generally bringing order to his bachelor existence. He paid her fairly $1 a day, which was generous by Cottonwood Springs standards. The ranch, as Randall had said, wasn't much to look at, but Grace found herself drawn to its quiet beauty. The small cabin sat nestled against a rise, protected from the worst of the wind. A creek ran nearby, providing precious water year-round. The barn did indeed lean slightly to the left, but inside it was clean and well-organized, evidence of Randall's methodical nature. She learned that he was a man of routines and principles, up before dawn to tend his animals, working from sunup to sundown with quiet determination. He was unfailingly polite, careful to maintain appropriate distance when she was working in his home. Never once did he make her uncomfortable or suggest anything improper. As June turned to July and the heat intensified, Grace found herself looking forward to the days at the ranch. In town, she was still the object of pity or speculation, the poor Matthews girl, all alone now, surely headed for ruin. But at Randall's place, she was simply herself, valued for her skills and company. One blazing afternoon, as Grace was hanging laundry on the line behind Randall's cabin, she noticed him by the corral, working with a young colt. Shirtless in the heat, his tanned skin gleamed with sweat as he moved with a gentle patience, gradually accustoming the nervous animal to human touch. The sight stirred something in Grace she hadn't felt before, a warmth that had nothing to do with the Arizona sun beating down. She quickly looked away, focusing on the sheets snapping in the hot breeze. But her awareness of Randall as a man rather than simply her employer had been awakened, and she found it impossible to unsee the broad planes of his shoulders or the gentle strength of his hands. That evening, as they sat on his porch eating the supper, she'd prepared a rabbit stew with the vegetables she'd coaxed from his small garden. Grace found herself watching him when he wasn't looking. The lines around his eyes spoke of both laughter and hardship. His hands, calloused and strong, handled his fork with surprising delicacy. "Why aren't you married?" The question escaped before she could stop it, and Grace immediately flushed. "I'm sorry, that's far too personal." Randall looked surprised but not offended. He set down his fork, considering his answer. "Was engaged once before the war. Margaret was her name." His eyes took on a distant look. "When I came back, I wasn't the same man who'd left. The things I'd seen done." He shook his head. "She tried, but in the end, she couldn't live with what I'd become." "And since then?" Grace asked softly. "Since then, I've been alone," Randall said simply. "Out here, there aren't many opportunities to court, and I've been focused on building something." He gestured to the land around them. "Besides, most women want more than I can offer." Grace wanted to tell him that what he offered, safety, respect, quiet strength, was worth more than all the fancy trappings some women chased. But the words stuck in her throat, too revealing of her growing feelings. "What about you?" Randall asked. "A pretty young woman like you must have had suitors." Grace shook her head. "Taking care of Mama was all I had time for, and before that," she hesitated. "There was someone back in Pennsylvania, Thomas Sheridan. We were sweet on each other, but when Papa died and we decided to come west, he wouldn't leave his family's business." The memory no longer stung as it once had. It was for the best. He wanted a wife who would host dinner parties and raise children, not nurse a sick mother. "His loss," Randall said with unexpected fierceness. "A man who wouldn't stand by you through hardship isn't worth your tears." The conviction in his voice warmed Grace in places long cold. As twilight deepened around them, fireflies beginning to flicker in the growing darkness, a comfortable silence settled between them, one filled with unspoken possibilities. In town, meanwhile, Grace's regular visits to Randall's ranch had indeed sparked gossip. Some, like kind-hearted Mrs. Peabody at the general store, defended the arrangement. "The girl needs work, and Randall Cooper's as honorable as they come," she insisted to anyone who would listen. "Besides, he brings her back to town before dark every time. There's nothing improper about it." Others were less charitable, particularly Silas Merrick, the undertaker who'd tried to charge Grace an exorbitant sum to bury her mother. His resentment of Randall's interference festered, and he began spreading insinuations about the nature of Grace's work at the ranch. The rumors reached Grace one afternoon as she was purchasing supplies at the general store. Two women behind her were whispering, not quite quietly enough, "Working for him 3 days a week, and him a bachelor living all alone out there. We know what kind of work that is. Such a shame." Her mother barely cold in the ground, and already she's, "Can I help you ladies with something?" Grace interrupted, turning to face them with her head held high despite the burning in her cheeks. The women Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Grayson, both wives of prosperous ranchers, had the grace to look embarrassed at being caught. "We're just concerned for your reputation, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, recovering quickly. "A young woman in your position can't be too careful. Mr. Cooper has been nothing but a gentleman and a Christian," Grace said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He offered honest work when this town would have seen me starve or worse. I would thank you to remember that before you soil his good name or mine." She paid for her purchases and left, shaking with a mixture of anger and humiliation. By the time Randall came to collect her the next morning, she had made a difficult decision. "I can't work for you anymore," she said as soon as he arrived at her cabin. Randall's face fell, genuine disappointment evident in his eyes. "Have I done something to offend you, Grace?" "No," she said quickly. "No, it's not you, it's—" She twisted her hands in her apron. "People are talking, saying things about us about me that aren't true." Understanding dawned in Randall's eyes, followed by anger. "Who's been talking? Tell me their names." "It doesn't matter," Grace said. "What matters is that my reputation is all I have left, and I can't—" "It matters to me," Randall interrupted, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You're the finest woman I know, Grace Matthews. I won't have anyone saying otherwise." His defense of her honor brought tears to Grace's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "but I still can't keep working for you, not like this." Randall was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, hesitant, almost vulnerable. What if there was another way, he asked. A way that would silence the gossips and give you security. Grace's heart began to pound. What do you mean? Randall removed his hat, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of nervousness she'd never seen from him before. I'm not good with words, Grace, never have been, but these past weeks having you at the ranch. He took a deep breath. The place feels empty when you're not there. I feel empty. Grace stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe as Randall continued. I know this isn't romantic. I know we haven't known each other long, not in the way of courtship. But I respect you, and I think you respect me. We get along well. We could build something good together. He met her eyes directly. I'm asking if you'd consider becoming my wife. Of all the possibilities Grace had imagined for her future after her mother's death, marriage to Randall Cooper hadn't been one of them. Yet as the words hung in the air between them, she found herself not shocked but relieved, as if some part of her had been waiting for precisely this moment. Is this just because of the gossip? She asked, needing to be sure. A marriage of convenience to protect my reputation? No, Randall said firmly. The gossip just made me realize I needed to speak now, before I lost my chance. I've been thinking about asking for weeks, but feared it was too soon after your mother's passing. Grace studied his face, looking for any sign of deception or pity. She found only sincerity and something else, a warmth in his eyes when they met hers that spoke of deeper feelings than mere convenience. I'm not asking for love, Randall continued when she remained silent. Not yet, but I think it could grow between us given time. I already care for you more than I've cared for anyone in a long time. His honesty touched Grace deeply. In a world where women were often lied to, manipulated, or worse, Randall Cooper stood before her offering the truth, however unvarnished. I need time to think, Grace said finally. This is unexpected. Randall nodded, replacing his hat. Of course, take all the time you need, the offer stands. He turned to go, then stopped. Whether your answer is yes or no, I'll still be your friend, Grace. That won't change. After he left, Grace sat alone in her cabin, mind whirling with the enormity of the decision before her. Marriage to Randall would solve her immediate problems: the gossip, her precarious financial situation, the loneliness of the empty cabin. But marriage was meant to be forever, a commitment before God and man. She thought of Randall, his quiet strength, his kindness, his capable hands. She thought of the ranch, how peaceful she felt there. She thought of the way he'd held her after her mother's burial, strong and steady when she needed someone to lean on. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was respect, friendship, and perhaps the beginnings of something deeper. Wasn't that more than many marriages started with? The next morning, Grace walked to Randall's ranch, a journey of nearly 3 miles under the relentless August sun. By the time she arrived, her dress was damp with sweat and dust covered her boots, but her mind was clear. Randall was in the corral, working with the young colt again. When he saw her approaching, he dropped the lead rope and hurried to meet her, concern etched on his features. Grace, you shouldn't have walked all this way in this heat. Let me get you some water. He led her to the porch, settling her in the shade before disappearing inside. He returned moments later with a dipper of cold water from the well. Grace drank gratefully, the water easing her parched throat. I have your answer, she said when she'd finished, setting the dipper aside. Randall sat beside her, his body tense with anticipation. I'm listening. Grace took a deep breath. I'll marry you, Randall Cooper, not just for convenience or security, but because I believe we could build a good life together. She met his gaze directly. I can't promise love yet, but I can promise loyalty, hard work, and honesty. The smile that broke across Randall's face was like sunrise after a long night, gradual at first, then blazing with joy. That's more than enough to start with, he said, reaching tentatively for her hand. When she didn't pull away, he enfolded it in his larger one, his touch gentle yet secure. When? He asked. Soon, Grace decided. Before the month's end, if that suits you. I see no reason to wait. 2 weeks later, on a clear Sunday morning, Grace Matthews became Grace Cooper in a simple ceremony at Cottonwood Springs Small Church. She wore her mother's blue dress, freshly washed and mended, with wildflowers in her hair. Randall wore his one good suit, nervousness and pride evident in every line of his body as he spoke his vows in a clear, steady voice. The townspeople attended out of curiosity as much as goodwill, but Grace found she didn't care. The gossips who had condemned her were now forced to offer congratulations, their previous insinuations made foolish by the respectability of marriage. After a small reception at the church cake provided by Mrs. Peabody, who had supported their relationship from the start, Randall and Grace drove to the ranch that was now their home. Along the way, they stopped at the ridge where Sarah Matthews was buried. "I thought you might want to tell her," Randall said softly, helping Grace down from the wagon. Tears filled Grace's eyes at his thoughtfulness. They stood together at the grave, which Randall had been tending in the weeks since the burial. Fresh wildflowers grew on the mound, and the wooden cross stood straight and proud. "I got married today, Mama," Grace said, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze. "To a good man who treats me with respect. I think you would have approved." Randall squeezed her hand but remained silent, giving her this moment with her mother's memory. "I miss you every day," Grace continued, "but I'm not alone anymore." As they drove the final miles to the ranch to home, the setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. Grace found herself studying her husband's profile, noting the strong jaw, the kind eyes, the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth that hinted at his capacity for joy despite the hardships he'd endured. At the ranch, Randall surprised her by lifting her from the wagon and carrying her across the threshold of the cabin. Inside, Grace found another surprise: the sparse bachelor quarters had been transformed. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, a colorful quilt covered the bed, and wildflowers brightened the table. Mrs. Peabody helped, Randall admitted, setting her down gently. Said a bride deserved something special, even out here. Grace touched the curtain's simple flower sack material, but dyed a cheerful yellow and neatly hemmed. "It's perfect," she said, meaning it. That night, as they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Grace discovered yet another facet of Randall Cooper. His hands, so capable with horses and tools, were gentle as they traced the contours of her body. His mouth, usually sparing with words, whispered praise and encouragement against her skin. Where she had expected awkwardness, there was instead a sweet discovery of pleasure neither had anticipated. "Are you all right?" Randall asked afterward, cradling her against his chest. "Yes," Grace whispered, surprised to find it was true. In his arms, she felt not just safe but cherished. It wasn't love yet, not the passionate love of novels and poems, but it was a beginning, a seed planted in fertile ground. As summer gave way to fall, Grace and Randall settled into the rhythms of married life. They worked side by side from dawn till dusk, tending animals, harvesting the small vegetable garden, preparing for winter. At night, they shared the warmth of their bed, gradually learning the language of each other's bodies, finding unexpected joy in physical intimacy. But it was in the quiet moments, sitting on the porch watching the sunset, reading aloud to each other by lamplight, sharing memories of their lives before they met, that something deeper began to grow. Grace found herself watching for Randall's return when he went to town, missing his presence even for a few hours. Randall began bringing her small gifts: a ribbon for her hair, a book of poetry, wildflowers gathered on his rides. In October, they traveled to town for supplies and encountered Silas Merrick outside the general store. The undertaker's eyes narrowed at the sight of them, his resentment still evident. "Well, if it isn't the happy couple," he said, his tone making the words an insult. "Married life seems to agree with you, Mrs. Cooper, though I wonder if your poor mother would approve of how quickly you replaced her." Before Grace could respond, Randall stepped forward, his usual calm demeanor replaced by cold anger. "Apologize to my wife, Merrick," the undertaker sneered. "For telling the truth. Everyone knows she only married you because she was desperate and alone." Randall's fists clenched at his sides, but Grace placed a restraining hand on his arm. "He's not worth it," she said quietly. Then, to Merrick, "My mother raised me to recognize a good man when I found one. She would be happy that I'm loved and cared for, which is more than can be said for the women unfortunate enough to cross your path." Taking Randall's arm, she walked past the sputtering undertaker with her head held high. Once they were out of earshot, Randall let out a low whistle. "Remind me never to anger you, Mrs. Cooper," he said with admiration, You've got a sharper tongue than I realized." Grace smiled up at him, surprised by her own boldness. "Only when defending those I care about." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement that what had begun as a marriage of convenience had become something more. Randall's gaze dropped to her lips, and right there on the main street of Cottonwood Springs, he kissed her, a brief but tender gesture that left Grace breathless. "Let's go home," he said, his voice husky. That night, as autumn wind rattled the windows of their snug cabin, Grace finally spoke the words that had been growing in her heart. "I love you," she whispered against Randall's shoulder as they lay entwined in the darkness. "I didn't expect to, but I do." Randall went very still, then rolled to face her, his features barely visible in the faint moonlight filtering through the window. "Say it again," he requested, his voice rough with emotion. "I love you, Randall Cooper," Grace repeated, stronger this time. "And I love you, Grace Cooper," he replied, gathering her close. "Have since the day I held you after your mother's burial, though I didn't recognize it then." As winter descended on the Arizona territory, bringing rare snowfall that transformed the landscape into a glittering wonderland, Grace and Randall's love deepened. The small ranch prospered under their joint care. Randall's strength and knowledge combined with Grace's practicality and eye for detail. They added a room to the cabin, anticipating a future that might include children. In December, Grace received news that filled her with both joy and trepidation. She was expecting a child, due in late summer. When she told Randall, his reaction swept away any fears. He lifted her in his arms and spun her around the cabin, laughing with pure happiness before setting her down carefully, suddenly concerned he might have hurt her. "Are you all right? Should you be resting? Do we need to send for the doctor?" The questions tumbled out, revealing his excitement and worry in equal measure. Grace laughed, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. "I'm fine. We're fine. The baby won't be here for months yet." Randall knelt before her, pressing his forehead against her midsection. "Hello in there," he whispered. "I'm your pa, and I promise to keep you and your ma safe always." The simple vow brought tears to Grace's eyes. From the moment she'd watched Randall dig her mother's grave with his own hands, she'd known he was a man who kept his promises. Spring brought new calves to the ranch, and visible changes to Grace's body. As her belly swelled with their growing child, Randall became even more attentive, insisting she rest during the hottest part of the day, taking over many of her chores despite her protests, reading to both her and the baby each night. In late April, a letter arrived that disrupted their peaceful existence. It was from Pennsylvania, from Thomas Sheridan, the man Grace had once thought she would marry. He wrote that he had never forgotten her, that his family's business was thriving, and that he had recently learned of her mother's passing. He was coming west on business and hoped to see her, to perhaps rekindle what they had once shared. Grace read the letter with disbelief, then handed it wordlessly to Randall. His face darkened as he read, jaw tightening with each line. "Will you see him?" he asked when he finished, his voice carefully neutral. "Of course not," Grace said, surprised by the question. "Whatever was between Thomas and me ended years ago. I'm your wife carrying your child." She took the letter from Randall's hands and tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames consumed Thomas Sheridan's belated declarations. "He had his chance to choose me, and he didn't. You did." Relief washed over Randall's face, followed by a love so powerful it nearly took Grace's breath away. "I thank God every day for that choice," he said, drawing her into his arms. When Thomas Sheridan arrived in Cottonwood Springs 2 weeks later, dressed in an Eastern suit that looked ridiculous in the frontier town, he was directed to the Cooper Ranch. He found not the desperate, malleable girl he remembered, but a confident woman standing beside her husband on their land, her pregnancy a visible testament to the life she had built without him. "Grace," Thomas said, removing his hat. "You look different." "I'm happy," she said simply. "This is my husband, Randall Cooper." The two men sized each other up, Thomas with his soft hands and expensive clothes, Randall with his weathered face and quiet strength. There was no contest, and all three knew it. "I should have come west with you," Thomas said, regret evident in his voice. I see that now. If you had, I might never have found where I truly belong, Grace replied, no malice in her words, just truth. After Thomas left, Randall turned to Grace with a question in his eyes. No regrets. Not one, she assured him, standing on tiptoe to kiss him beneath the vast Arizona sky. Summer arrived with brutal heat and the promise of new life. By August, Grace was heavy with child, finding comfort in the early mornings and evenings when the temperature dropped to bearable levels. Randall built a rocking chair for the porch, where Grace would sit watching the sunset, his hands often resting protectively on her rounded belly. On a scorching afternoon in late August, exactly 1 year after Sarah Matthews' death, Grace's labor began. Randall rode like the wind to fetch Mrs. Peabody, who had experience as a midwife. By the time they returned, Grace's pains were coming fast and strong. "This baby's in a hurry to meet the world," Mrs. Peabody declared, shooing Randall from the bedroom. For hours, Randall paced the cabin, flinching at each cry from behind the closed door. When a new sound joined the chorus, the indignant wail of a newborn, he froze, heart pounding in his chest. Mrs. Peabody emerged, wiping her hands on her apron, a broad smile on her face. "Congratulations, Mr. Cooper. You have a healthy daughter." Randall entered the bedroom on shaky legs to find Grace propped up on pillows, exhausted but radiant, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he approached, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Meet your daughter," she said, tilting the bundle so he could see the tiny face red and wrinkled, with a shock of dark hair. Randall sat carefully on the edge of the bed, reaching out a tentative finger to stroke the baby's cheek. "She's perfect," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "Just like her mother. I want to name her Sarah," Grace said. "After my mother, Sarah Cooper." Randall tested the name, finding it strong and sweet. "It's perfect." As twilight settled over the ranch, Mrs. Peabody took her leave, promising to return the next day to check on mother and child. Randall settled beside Grace on the bed, his arm around her shoulders, their daughter sleeping peacefully between them. "A year ago today, I thought my life was ending," Grace said softly. "I had lost my mother, had nothing to my name but grief and a handful of coins." She looked up at Randall, love shining in her eyes. "And then you came, dug a grave, and held me while I cried. How could I have known that was just the beginning?" Randall pressed a kiss to her forehead, then to their daughters. "Not the beginning," he corrected gently. "Just another step in the journey." Outside, stars appeared one by one in the vast Arizona sky, bearing witness to the family cradled within the small ranch house, a family forged from grief and kindness, built on respect and honesty, and now flourishing with love. In the years that followed, the Cooper Ranch prospered. Randall's careful management and Grace's tireless work transformed the modest homestead into one of the most successful small ranches in the territory. They added to their herd, built a larger barn, and expanded the cabin to accommodate their growing family. Sarah was joined by a brother, James, 2 years later, and then by another sister, Elizabeth, the following year. The Cooper children grew strong in the Arizona sun, learning the rhythms of ranch life from their parents, how to ride almost before they could walk, how to respect the land that sustained them, how to face hardship with courage and good times with gratitude. Each year on the anniversary of Sarah Matthews' death, the family would make the journey to the ridge where she was buried. As the children grew old enough to understand, Grace would tell them stories of their grandmother, her courage in coming west, her gentle hands, her love of wildflowers. Randall would stand beside her, his presence a reminder of how love could bloom from the most barren soil of loss. On the 10th anniversary of their marriage, Randall surprised Grace with a proper headstone for her mother's grave, ordered all the way from back east. The simple marble marker gleamed in the sunlight, Sarah Matthews' name and dates carved in elegant script, with the words "Beloved Mother" beneath. "How did you afford this?" Grace asked, tears streaming down her face as she traced the letters. "Been saving a little each month for years," Randall admitted. "Wanted to do this for you, for her." Grace turned to her husband, seeing in his face the same steadfast love that had sustained her for a decade. The handsome young cowboy who had dug her mother's grave had weathered into a mature man, lines etched around his eyes from squinting into the sun, gray beginning to thread through his hair. Yet his strength remained undiminished, his blue eyes still clear and kind. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing the words were inadequate for the life he had given her. That night, after the children were asleep, Grace and Randall sat on their porch beneath a canopy of stars. His arm was around her shoulders, her head resting against him in the comfortable way of long married couples who have shaped themselves to fit each other. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had been able to afford a proper funeral for my mother?" Grace asked suddenly. "If I hadn't needed your help that day," Randall was quiet for a moment, considering. "I like to think we would have found each other anyway," he said finally. "Some things are meant to be, Grace." She smiled at that, thinking of all the seemingly random choices and circumstances that had brought them together: her father's death, her mother's illness, their separate journeys west, his kindness on the worst day of her life. "I believe that too," she said, lifting her face for his kiss. As Randall's lips met hers, Grace thought of the young woman she had been broken by grief, alone and afraid. That woman could never have imagined the life waiting for her, the love that would heal her wounded heart, the family that would fill her days with purpose and joy. From the greatest loss of her life had come its greatest blessing: proof that even in the harsh landscape of the Arizona Territory, in the unforgiving reality of the American frontier, love could take root and flourish, transforming barren ground into fertile soil for a future neither could have envisioned alone. And it had all begun with a grave dug by willing hands and arms strong enough to hold her while she grieved.